most welcome.
Yeah, thank you for this welcome, and thank you for having me here. It's well, I'm very happy to stand here and be able to talk to you. And I know that's somewhat the polite and decent thing to say if you're doing a lecture, but I'm Dutch. We only say nice things if you really mean them. There was this song we sang, "Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise." I can assure you, we don't have to sing this song in Holland. We don't do empty praise. As a matter of fact, we don't do praise at all. So believe me, I'm serious about it. I'm very happy to be here. It's a privilege, because my wife and I have been attending these conferences, I think, for 8 years. I think it's the fourth. And every time I'm impressed by how to put this, God's strength and weakness. Many of you, I know, are working in very difficult circumstances, very European, very secular, indifferent towards the gospel or towards any form of serious religion. And yet, I believe, and I say, the Bible tells us so, that this is where God works, through weakness, through those who are foolish in the eyes of the world, and maybe even foolish in their own eyes, especially when they look at statistics and growth figures and stuff like that, which is usually the growth figures of other people and not of yourself. So this is, I believe, where God is doing great things, and the people through whom God is doing great things in Europe, in this continent. I very much related to what I think Thiago was his name, told us about doing mission in Europe. The things about it, it's not that simple, was one part of it, but also the idea that you can be really creative when you're marginalized, when you don't fit in, that this is where the prophets come from in the Bible, and I suppose today as well. Now, what I'm going to do, I think you found a sheet with some lecture notes, I hope, around your chair, so you can jot down some notes if you want to. I've tried to make it as academic and as boring as possible, and I think I've done a good job. But I'll leave some things out here and there and skip some things and change some things, so don't take it too literally. And to show my good intentions, I'll skip the first point and go to the second right away. So what I'm going to do is to present some evidence, some material from my new book, which will be out in September, on church planting in the secular West. And I'll focus on two different motivations behind church planting in the 20th century and in this particular century as well. The first one is growth, or conversion growth, to be more specific. So the idea that church planting helps the church to grow, not just to grow, but to grow through converts, to people who are initiated to the Christian faith for the first time in their lives. Peter Wagner, his famous quote, church planting, he says, is the most effective evangelistic methodology under heaven. I suppose you've heard it, and also the other one, that it's easier to have babies than to raise the dead, which is not a nice thing to say in Europe, is it? Or everywhere else? But anyway, that's what he said. I just quoted the first one because I think that's the better one. Anyway, and the second motivation behind church planting, and I think this is specifically emerging, let's say, in the beginning of the 21st century and a little bit before that, but it's beginning to grow now, is the idea that church planting is also an opportunity for experimentation, for renewal of the church, for innovation, to try things out that can be tried out in these new places rather than in older, more balanced churches, so to speak. So Stuart Murray, to quote him, for example, he says, church planting is an opportunity for theological reflection and renewal, for asking radical questions about the nature of the church and its task in contemporary society, and for developing new kinds of churches. So I hope you recognize something of that and maybe experience something of that as well, that church planting can be a location par excellence of asking new questions, where questions are raised that you don't find, at least not that urgently in all the questions. Now let's look at these two. I've asked Sean to keep track of time a bit, so he will raise his hand if I am too long or boring, or both. Anyway, so we start with church planting as an instrument of growth, as an instrument, as a way to grow the church, to conversion. Let's just take very quickly some assumptions, and these assumptions are from social science, because church planting in a missiological discourse that we know, let's say as we talk in church and in theology, is mirrored, so to speak, by social science discourse about what's called religious market theory. The idea that societies, or religion in society, will do better when it is disestablished, so to speak. So when there is no longer a monopoly by one church, or by the state suppressing all churches, which is also possible, for example, before 1989, behind the Iron Curtain. So if there is a monopoly, as for example, if I got the Portuguese brothers right, here in Portugal, where the Roman Catholic Church, by and large, is the monopolist in religion, so to speak, then the theory goes that this will usually affect church-going and religion, in the sense that there will a huge number of nominal Christians, but not many people who are really serious about it, because in the end, there's only one size and one taste for everyone, one flavor for everyone, and this will usually cause people, well, to be a bit distant about religion, but being religious nevertheless, so they are nominals, so to speak. Now, the idea is that as soon as religion is disestablished, meaning if there's separation between church and state, if the state no longer suppresses religion, or if there's no longer just one particular church doing everything in the field of religion, then there will come room for other churches having a different, well, excuse me for the economic language, having a different supply, basically, which will help a better fit between religious demand and religious supply. So the idea is that religious consumers have different and changing needs, and they operate on the basis of rational calculation. So when they have a whole field of options between churches, the idea is that people usually look at those churches that will help them best to fulfill their objectives in life against the lowest costs. I'm sorry, again, but that's the way social scientists talk about that. Now, it makes some sense if you look at church planting literature. It usually says that if there are more churches, if there are more diversity of churches, it's usually better for the whole church. I think you've read those things and heard about those things, and maybe seen something of it in your own experience. So if you look at Europe, for example, and see secularization and see the decline of the church, the idea here is the problem is in the church, basically. Not in society, not in religious demand of people, that it remains by and large unstable, the same throughout the ages, but the problem is in the church. So if you change something in the church, if you have more churches, better churches, more diverse supply of churches, then people will come to church again, will become more believing, more Christian again, and so on. That's the idea. And that's, then it makes sense, of course, to plant churches, and a lot of them, and especially different types of churches. Now, that's the theory, the question, of course, is, to what extent is it true? Does it really work like that in Europe? Now, there are some things to say in favor of it and some things against it. I'll look to the empirical data just in a few moments, but let me look first at some, well, theological reflections on that. Some of you have barely recovered from my talk in Berlin in 2011, where I said some things about theological objections against church growth theory, against the idea that the church is there to grow. So I won't go into that again, because some of you have, well, they just stopped hating me for that. So, but just one thing about that. One of my main objections, theological objections, against the idea that the church is on the earth to grow, is that it very easily makes us being focused on numbers rather than on people. Makes us being obsessed with statistics rather than with human beings who are image bearers of God. So, and especially in a very secular environment where, as Thiago and other people told us, conversions usually happen slow, and are few and far between. We need a different theology than just the church is there to grow. Not just because it's unpractical in Europe, I think theological objections go before that, but especially in Europe, you find that this does not help the church very much. The gospel says that there is joy in heaven for every sinner who repents. The statistical answer in Europe would be only one. See what I mean? That it brings us on a different track than the Bible does. Apparently it's possible to be full of joy, and heaven is full of joy, about one person. That's not about numbers. That is about human beings who come to their destination in God. So, to put it a bit differently, my theological problem with the idea that the church is on the earth to grow is that it very easily makes mission or evangelism an instrument, instrumentalizes mission towards the growth of the church, and it's no longer a good thing in itself, so to speak, to share the gospel, to share the joy of the gospel, and to point out to people what the gospel is about, and to welcome converts now and then in Europe. So I think the best way to look at conversion theologically and new Christians coming into the church is to look at them as signs of the kingdom to come. So if you look at the Gospels and the parables of Jesus about the heavenly banquet and the king celebrating a meal with his servants and so on, and inviting all people from the street, then the idea is there's growth there, of course, there's numbers, but the idea is, I suppose, that these numbers reflect the coming kingdom. So every person who gets converted, who becomes a Christian, is, I think, a hopeful sign for the church that, yes, the kingdom is coming, and Christ has come, and something is changing in this world. But it's not always seen in huge numbers or in statistical differences. Now, so far, my theological objections, and the other talk in Berlin, it's still on the internet, I saw. So if you feel for some more torture, then just look at that one. There's something to say in favor of it as well. The whole idea, and I think there may be a difference between America and Europe as well. In Europe, social scientists have usually discussed secularization as a sort of natural law. It is happening. You can't avoid it. It's just happening. It's a matter of modernization of society. Societies that become more modern, become more secular, and you can't do anything about it. Whereas, as far as I can see, Americans tend to emphasize more the individual liberty of choice, the idea that individuals can change their environment, to some extent at least. I mean, we're not narcissists, we can't change everything, but we can change something. Our choices matter. So individuals are not just, powerless victims of secularization. And churches are not powerless victims of secularization. Their policies, their decisions, they matter and they can make a difference. That's, I think, one of the lessons that the Americans have taught Europe, and which, for example, is expressed in the whole idea of church planting. If the church couldn't do anything about it, then we could stop church planting and could stop evangelizing, because it would happen or it would not happen, but we couldn't do anything about it. So there is, I think, something empowering in the whole idea that secularization is not just a natural law. It is something that, in the end, is based on the decisions of human beings, and other human beings can change, at least influence it a bit through their own decisions. Another objection from a social scientific perspective is, of course, that the whole idea that religious demands, so to speak, the religious needs of people, remain stable throughout centuries, and that the whole problem is in the church, does not seem to be true. Religious demand does change throughout centuries and through cultures. In some cultures it seems to be higher than in other cultures. And of course, everyone in Europe has, at least if you're seriously into church planting, I think most of you will have experienced that it's not just a matter of more churches and better churches. There's something different going on as well. There's also something in people. And at least where I live, there are many people who will not come to church unless a miracle happens, regardless of how well you do it. They're different people than their ancestors. Or maybe not so different, but anyway. So far, that's the more theological perspectives. maybe you'd like to see some evidence. I always like the numbers and the figures, but I know not everyone does. But just bear with me. Some evidence from Europe. Is there any statistical evidence that church planting, in terms of church growth, works? That indeed new churches, for example, have more converts, that they draw more people? Because, like I said, even if the church is not on the earth to grow, conversions are an important sign of the kingdom. We would like to see them. And if new churches have more of them, this may be an interesting thing to know and an interesting thing to influence our policies. Now, the problem is, one of the problems, there are many, one of the problems is there's hardly any research which can be used. Most research is actually worthless. Inaccessible data, definitions are wrong, or they come from churches who, and excuse me if you're one of them, they come from churches who just baptize everyone who comes in, regardless of where they come from. And then they count them as new converts, which is, I'm not talking about theology here, but statistically it's quite worthless. Because it's from the idea that new Christians come into church, this is not really church growth, is it? Now, there are some recent research projects that seem to deliver some data that can be relied on a bit more, and that are, from a methodological point of view, a bit better. And I've put some tables on your sheet. It's on the third page. I'm just presenting two of them here, one from the Netherlands and one from Germany. One of the problems of writing a book on church planting in Europe is the huge diversity of languages. Not every country has been accessible for me. I don't read Czech, for example. Most of my research comes from, let's say, the Netherlands, Germany, England, France, Belgium, and those countries. But Portugal, for example, I found it very interesting to read this stuff, but I don't read Portuguese. Very irritating thing in Europe, all these languages, and there's beauty in it as well. But we would need another Pentecost, actually. Anyway, some data from Dutch research in 2012. One of my students did this research, and he made a comparison between in three smaller Reformed denominations, which keep track of their members and the change in membership very carefully. That helps, of course, if you look into these figures. And just to cut to the chase, what this research shows is that newer churches indeed grow a lot better in terms of conversion growth than older churches. It's a very small sample, so we should be careful about that, but the evidence seems unequivocal. I mean, it's quite clear that older churches' total converts per year, about 60, church plants, 45, but as the church plants are far fewer, you see that if you look at the rate of converts per membership, so that's, let me see, calculated per involved people, there it is, the first column. You see with church plants, it's one convert per year, one convert on every 31 members. With the older churches, one on every 964. And if you take only the 13 most effective older churches, then it's one on every 244. So if you take the best sample from the older churches, and you take the younger churches and you leave out the best growers there, so the worst sample, so to speak, then you see even then it's about a 5-to-1 ratio. So that's clear evidence that, at least in this particular project, that younger churches indeed grow better. I'll go into the explanations soon enough, but let's look at Germany secondly. There's some evidence here from which I got very recently from the Bund Freie Evangelische Gemeinde. So that's a free evangelical church, basically. It's an older church, not very new. And the interesting thing here is they baptize children and adults, so they don't just count every believer's baptism as a new Christian. They have a dual practice baptism. And some other indications that help me, at least, to trust these data quite well. If you look at these churches, you see that the younger churches among these in this denomination have only 5% of the total membership, but they have 16 or even almost 17% of all converts. And again here, the ratio of converts per members is 1 on every 34. You can compare that with the Dutch example, 1 in every 31, so it's about comparable. Interesting also is, and that shows from all the research actually, that by far not all young churches are growing or are drawing converts at all. Here in the German example, it's only half of the young churches that do draw converts, 49%, and even a third of these younger churches is in decline, as you can see. My student didn't look into that for the Dutch churches, but I can tell you that basically the same is true there. So if you look more carefully into the whole sample of young churches, of the church plants, so to speak, then you can see that it's not just a matter of being young, of being planted. There's something else going on there as well. Because just being young is not enough to explain growth, because about half of the young churches does not grow at all, in terms of conversion, I mean. They may have some transfers from other churches, but that's not what I'm counting here. So some explanations, and if you flip back to point 5 on your sheet. As a group, you can say the new churches grow better than older churches as a group. So I'm not talking about individual churches here. Many young churches do not grow. Some older churches grow better than many young churches. So it's a complicated picture. But we have to explain why the young churches as a group grow better. Now, growth seems to be correlated with the age of the church, but not causally. What do I mean with that? I hope you've heard something about correlations over against causal relationship. So take a correlation, for example, bad breath and yellow fingers. Most people who have bad breath have also yellow fingers, and especially people with yellow fingers, they do have bad breath. But does bad breath cause yellow fingers? Or does yellow fingers, do they cause bad breath? No, they're both caused by smoking. Yes, so the causal relationship is smoking causes both phenomena. Now here also, if you see that young churches usually correlate with conversion growth, is being young the cause of it, or do young churches have certain factors involved that are more often present in young churches and are causes of growth, at least in social scientific terms? And the answer seems to be yes. Location, legwork, and leadership. The 3 L's seem to be more present in younger churches. They're more often in good locations, where there is demographic growth and so on, immigration and stuff like that. Makes sense, of course, because young churches, usually they are planted in good places. And when they grow older and demographics shift, then they can be in a bad place. But as long as they're young, they're usually in a good place. Legwork, what we find in our research is that in younger churches usually invest more time and money and energy in evangelism, basically plain evangelism. If you want my answer to what is the secret of conversion growth, it's a very difficult, mysterious answer: evangelism. That's what research finds, but usually that is what research does. It finds things that we all know, but needs some evidence to back it up. And leadership. So the kind of the people who lead church plants often self-define as entrepreneurs, rather than in the older churches where pastors self-define as teachers more often, that we find. So maybe we can discuss about it a little bit later, but these are the things that we have found. So strategically, I would say this means that church planting, in terms of strategy, and if there are any denominational leaders here, I think it's good to pay attention here. Church planting is a good way for denominations and mission organizations to be in tune with demographic changes and to release entrepreneurial or evangelistic leadership. But if this is not there, this type of leadership and a good place, then church planting in itself will do nothing in terms of conversion growth. So church planting is not the panacea of growth. There are some factors involved in church planting that can help the church to grow. But if these factors are involved in older churches, I wouldn't know any reason why the older churches couldn't grow as well. Now, what does it mean for you as a leader? Looking at this more or less social scientific picture, I always say social science describes how things happen now. It doesn't predict. Because, like I said, it's not a natural law. When I say to my students often, I say, if you go out and try to change gravity, for example, a natural law, then I wish you good luck. I doubt very much whether you should pray for that. But if you want to change social reality, and that's what we're speaking about, why not? I mean, what we're describing here in social science is in the end a social reality, a social world. that is made up by people, by millions of individual choices, integrating and interacting with each other. So, like I said, we are not narcissists. We don't believe that one person can change the world or whatever, at least unless you're Jesus Christ, but not us, can we? But we can do something. Our choices matter. And that is, I think, a teaching that should help us to, insight that should help us as leaders to think about this and to be encouraged by, well, don't let yourself being led by statistics. Not even in Europe. A friend of mine who is a very enthusiastic evangelist, he always says things like, the fields are white for harvest in the Netherlands. Many people are hungry for the gospel. Well, from an academic perspective, I say you're talking rubbish, basically. That's not true. I mean, look at all the statistics. And yet, people seem to listen to him. And he seems to be able to, indeed, to communicate the gospel to people, probably because he never reads statistics. So you see what I mean? Don't treat this kind of stuff. I mean, it gives some wisdom, it gives some insight in how reality works today, but don't treat them as gospel truth, as a sort of doctrinal basis for your work, as something that should inform you in your deepest motivations, or because in the end, this is not what we work for. We don't work for the next version of the statistical handbook. Now, how much time do I have left? Okay, so I'm halfway. That's good, because I'm going to the second part now. So church planting as an instrument of innovation, that would be the second one, and the most recent motivation. So there's little data yet. It's more difficult to research also, because what is innovation? I won't go into all these details with you. There's a lot of this in the book. But let me just point out two things, or two assumptions behind this. The idea that church planting is a place for experimentation. The first is that church planting has the potential to undermine our traditional thinking about church. So I meet a lot of people who won't even call themselves church planters anymore, because they feel a bit uncomfortable with the word church, at least the word church as it is usually taken or defined in Europe. So they say, well, leave the word church for a while. I'm planting gospel seeds or kingdom seeds or whatever, and we'll see what comes from it. But the word church, well, we'll see. So all kinds of traditional thinking about church and sort of templates that are in our brains, especially when you're socialized in the church, are not always helpful when you do mission in a very secular environment. So church planting can be a way to really put those questions into a crisis and ideas of church into a crisis. And the second, and that's again a Stuart Murray quote, innovative church planting is pioneering on behalf of the whole church. For me, that's a very important thing. Church planting is not about sectarianism. It's not about go do your own thing because you'll feel called to it. In the end, you'll need to think, at least that's what I believe the innovation perspective teaches us, you need to think about how this, what we find here, will benefit the whole church in the end. Or are we just doing things and hope that the rest will catch up with us? Which is maybe a bit arrogant to work in this way. So these are the two things I think they're very important assumptions when you talk about church planting for innovation. Now, why is it important to think about renewal and about innovation? Of course, I can put this in a doctrinal way. I can say the church is always reformed, as we know. Many of you have learned that. But that's somewhere in your head. Does not always touch your reality. So why is it important in Europe, and especially in secular Europe, to think about and to really work towards the renewal of the church? And to do it together. Now, I think because Europe, one of the problems in Europe is that not just there are quite a few Christians, but also that they're very divided, and that they have their own pictures of reality, and often refuse or are unable to share these pictures with each other to get a fuller grasp of reality as it shows to us. For example, well, I always think about this Dutch proverb that, maybe you know it, if a man has only a hammer, everything looks like a nail to him. See what I mean? So if you only have a screwdriver, well, so there are churches who have only hammers, there are churches who have only screwdrivers, and they all think that they have the solution and they have the final analysis of what it is all about in Europe and what's the problem in Europe. So there's these three frames that you often hear: post-Christendom, the post-modern, and the post-Christian. Now, we could talk about it for a week, so I'm just doing that very quickly. But the post-Christendom frame is basically about separation of church and state, about the separation of politics and Christianity and religion. So the free market idea, the free market of religion. Every church is free to operate in this country or in this continent without being interfered by government or by other churches. That's the post-Christendom idea. And as you know, in some countries in Europe, this is very far advanced, so to speak, and other countries of Europe are still very much in Christendom. So Europe is very different there. But the idea is, especially in the neo-Anabaptist tradition, Stuart Murray, whom I quoted a few times, is one of those. Maybe you heard names like John Howard Yoder, Stanley Hauerwas, influential theologians who tend to think into this direction. They say the problem with Europe was Christendom. That was the problem. It was all about that it was assumed that you were a Christian as soon as you had been baptized as an infant, that it was assumed that every decent citizen of a European state was a Christian, and especially usually a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox Christian, or in the northern parts of Europe, a Lutheran Christian. So there were certain assumptions that wherein citizenship and a religious identity were sort of mixed together and were seen as one and the same thing from different perspectives. The answer to Christendom, and which would also help us now, is to create countercultural communities. That's the idea among new Anabaptists. We could say a lot about that, but it's one answer, it's one perspective. It's the hammer and the nail. But there are other answers as well, other perspectives as well. And what I often see is that these perspectives do not interact very much and do not learn very much from each other. So the postmodern perspective, for example, you find that among the emerging church, for a lot of people like, Alan Hirsch, Michael Frost, very influential writers as well, who always talk about deinstitutionalization. The idea that the church has become an institution, which is very modern, and modern is wrong in this literature, it's always wrong. We should become postmodern, and postmodern means that you become a movement, not institutional at all, and so on and so forth. And again, there's a lot of wisdom in this perspective as well, but it's just one perspective. This is the screwdriver who sees a screw everywhere. So, and then there's the post-Christian, and I think among evangelicals, this is the most neglected perspective, actually. The idea that Europe is also a post-Christian continent. And when I talk to mainline Christians from the big Protestant church or the Roman Catholic church, they often tend to emphasize this particular part. They say the problem in Europe is that once we could educate whole populations into Christianity through catechesis, through schools, and so forth, and so on, and now people do not know anything about Christianity anymore. They don't know the stories. They don't respect religious authority anymore. They've become completely pagan, or not really pagan, post-Christian, which is even more difficult. So they have been inoculated with a weak version of Christianity for some centuries, and now they know enough about it to be against it, but not much more. So the post-Christian perspective, which, as you may recall, also complicates the picture of, well, church planting is the answer, because it's not just the answer to plant more churches, there's also something going on with those people you're trying to reach. They're post-Christians. They think they know they are against Christendom as well. So yeah, Christendom was a bad thing. But they are very suspicious against every new attempt to mission, because they immediately feel that you're going to do Christendom again, especially when you talk about changing the world for Christ, transformation of society, and all these very popular terms among Christians, and especially missionally minded Christians. What transformation of society? We had a transformed society for some centuries, if I recall, and it was not a success very much, thank you. So stuff like this. So what I believe is that if church planting will become something of innovation, we need each other. We need to do more together. Not just as Protestants. I even believe that we should work together with Catholics wherever possible. I think Thiago talked about the serious Catholics in Portugal. He said we're not against them. I'm not talking about Portugal, but when I look at the Netherlands, for example, I see some good interactions nowadays, some good working together of Christians who have very different perspectives on very different things, but precisely because of that, have also something to teach each other about what's going on in Europe. Now, innovation. Just to get a picture, what's going on here. You know what a hedgehog is, don't you? A hedgehog, in Dutch is an egel, but I'm not sure about Portuguese. Like Neil, my Portuguese is very good, but not always. Yeah, so a hedgehog in Portuguese, I'm not sure. But anyway, a hedgehog, a small animal with spikes all around him, he rolls up into a prickly ball if some danger comes. You know what I mean? Okay. Are there any hedgehogs in this country? Is it? Okay. It was there in South Africa. It was a krimpvarkie, I've been told. But anyway. So, think of a hedgehog. A hedgehog has learned some very good tricks over the centuries. It has learned how to, face danger, basically, how to survive, how to be successful. And he knows one trick very, very well. This is to roll up, to put out his spikes, so to speak. And if the fox comes, and a fox is a much cleverer animal than the hedgehog, but he always loses. You can't beat the hedgehog. Now, and that's a tragic day, people, because on this particular day, the hedgehog tries to cross a new track in his world. It's dark, it's tarmac, and there in far distance, a noise starts to appear, and big yellow eyes start to shine, and a sound. And it's a very big animal. The animal makes sounds like, in American it would be honk honk. I'm not sure how it would be in Dutch. It would be toot toot. So it's what's coming up. And the hedgehog does what it's always learned. I mean, the best thing in its tricks. It rolls up and waits out the danger, which is the worst thing it could do. And that is, people, what crisis and renewal is all about. In a crisis, you learn that the best things you know become your worst overnight. We have a very rapidly changing society, and the church has to learn that it's not an idea that all its tricks, so to speak, were bad, were theologically not responsible or whatever, but they simply seem to work against you in a new situation. And that's what the hedgehog can teach us. And also, it shows what renewal is about and how critical it is and how dangerous it is. Because the only way for the hedgehog to survive and to thrive in a world with cars is to learn new tricks. To learn to run, probably, or to hide, or just wait before crossing a road, and not just trusting on your defense mechanisms. So you need to learn new things. And my intuition is that probably the new leaders in this context will be those hedgehogs that were not very good at rolling up in the first place. So the marginals, those who didn't fit in too well. Which may be a good place for church planting, isn't it? To send out those people who are a bit difficult sometimes, who don't seem to know all the tricks that we expect them to know, the centuries-old mechanisms that we have learned so well, and that are not bad in themselves, not at all, but to send out those people and to let them do some things that other people can't. And this is a risk situation because you never know what will come. That is innovation. If you can predict innovations, it's not innovation, of course. If you can see from here what the innovation will lead to, then there's no innovation at all. So innovation is a sort of a dark road. You set out, you put trust in people, and then you hope that something will come from it. The answer will not be to import models, for example, models from the outside. One of the things I like about Redeemer is that it has never presented itself, as a model, as something to be copied and to be pasted in a European situation. Because you know what the problem is with models. So there's one particular growing church somewhere, usually in the Anglo-Saxon world, as in London or Chicago. And then people start to think, what is their secret? How does it come that they grow so fast? And then what usually happens is often happens is that someone is writing a book, he picks out all the factors that can be copied, that can be translated into other contexts, and then make a model of that, and leave out all the factors that were mysteriously involved in this particular context, like demographic changes or economic changes or financial crisis or a gifted leader. So no matter how often you try to copy Redeemer, Tim Keller is not involved in the package, which may be a problem for us. So don't try to copy models, don't try to work out models, but renewal is not about trying to reduce the danger and the risk, even not through church planting, but to somehow maintain the transitional stage where we're in and try to well, through prayer, through working together, and to be creative, find those new things. It's a bit like gardening. I love gardening, especially when my wife does it. It's a beautiful image. Cultivation and planting. Alan Roxburgh wrote something about it, which I very much endorse. He says, in that planting process, I was making something not by the imposition of my will, but by working with and becoming part of a process that was much greater than myself and my tools. Cultivation is a process that is, at its heart, profoundly mysterious. And I believe there's no secret, no formula of renewal. If I had a bit more time, I could, but it's on the handout as well, so you can find it there. But there is some theory about it. But in the end, it has a lot to do with spirituality, I think, with being able to work with mystery, so to speak, and to bear the risk of being this non-fitting hedgehog who needs to lead the way to renewal in a very dangerous situation where all hedgehogs are crying, help us to reduce the risk. So God teaches us through our weakness. Now, I'll leave the point 9, I'll skip it. You can find some general ideas from innovation theory there that seem to be involved in really innovative environments. I'll just quote them very quickly, but I won't go into them too deeply. It's distance from the center. So you need places where there's a lot of distance from the center, where there's not so much control, unregulated, a bit, lack of compromise, where it's possible to experience that. And also you need a sort of environment where very different people can meet. Usually, if you want to be an innovative church, it's not a very wise decision to try to make it as homogeneous as possible. You can see why. I mean, if you're surrounded by people who are just like you and think like you and believe like you, usually you feel very comfortable with them, but you're not very challenged to think differently or to ask new questions. So an environment where people share certain values and certain purposes, but have different ideas about things can be very helpful. For example, multicultural churches can be very helpful towards renewal. Yeah, let me just go to the last point and then give Sean the floor. So one of the questions could be, where does all this renewal lead to? I mean, is innovation, is it not regulated in any way? Well, in a sense, it's not. You cannot regulate the process too much, but of course the outcomes are important. And as Christians and as churches, I think we have a certain right to know what comes out of these experiments. So I think one of the tasks of a humble leader, so to speak, is to be open towards the feedback and criticism of other churches, but also to think that the things you find here in this particular context are not necessarily those things that will survive to the next generation. So there is something in Christianity, and especially in the Christian church, working together, that you have to look, to think through the things you find here. Can they be, in the end, can they have sort of confessional value? Can we share them with other Christians, and we should do, in conferences like this is a good place for that. And do they recognize it? Do they say, yeah, there's wisdom in that? This is something we really needed you for, to find that. And we recognize that, and then maybe it can become something of the whole church in the end. I think only in this way the scriptural, creedal, and confessional structures of Christianity are respected. Innovation is always innovation on behalf of the whole church. So, sorry about going too rapidly through the last part, but as always, I underestimated the time I had. So, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Have a seat.
Yep.
No, it's okay, thanks. Keep it up. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan.
You're welcome.
We're going to have some time now to talk with and unpack some things with Stefan. If you would like to send a question yourself, you can see the email in the back, and the questions will be sent to us, and we're going to talk. So first, before going to the content, actually we heard you have a very interesting relationship with your dog. Can you tell us a little bit more about your dog and what's going on there?
Who told you?
I won't say anything, but
The
let's just
dog.
say Martin.
Well, it's a British dog. That's helpful. She doesn't understand Dutch or any other language. But yeah, we do have a relationship. And I've been told once that, maybe you can relate to that, who has a dog here? Who owns a dog? Yeah. So the dogs are a bit like their owners, aren't they? I mean, if you see pictures of dog owners and the dog together, then they look like each other. Now, it was a scary thing for me to read that, and then we tried it out with our dog, and actually, it's true. Yes, our dog is a bit like me. I'm still processing that. But yeah, it's a wonderful animal, absolutely.
But is it true that he responds to 60 commands of something?
It's a she, so
she?
it's
Okay.
it's a bit less.
Yes.
Yeah,
Touché.
but it has the potential to obey 300 commands. But if I try only one, she looks at me and thinks, potential is not reality, friend. So she teaches us as much as we teach her. But yeah, she usually she listens well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start us off then. It was interesting that you were saying, comparing younger churches to older churches, that as a group you're saying younger churches tend to grow more.
Yeah.
But 50% you pointed out don't grow at all. And some factors you pointed out, location, legwork, and leadership. Can you unpack a little bit more these three factors comparing the younger churches that do not grow and the churches that grow a lot?
Well, I must repeat that until now we only have very little reliable research. So I'm just making some best guesses here. I suppose if you look into a sort of comparison between younger churches that do draw more than the average convert and those who don't, as far as my theory goes now, it probably is somewhere in those factors. So maybe location. You're simply not there where the people come and live, and immigrants coming in or new people coming in. That can be a huge factor. Actually, it seems from all kinds of research on both sides of the Atlantic that this may be the most crucial factor, like when you're buying a house, location. That's a lot. That's important. Maybe a matter of leadership, but and of course the actual energy spent in evangelism. Sometimes I tend to think that it's also a reason when I talk with people who say our church is not growing that much as the books have promised. We don't draw as many converts. I say, well, think through how much actual energy do you spend on it. But location, that's I think quite well confirmed in the evidence. The other two are a bit more wobbly until now. But yeah, I would say usually it's one of those three, or maybe all three together, that are involved. Something else I wanted to say. Oh yeah. Let me repeat. This is not mathematics. I mean, maybe you've done everything right, and still it's not working. So think about the garden and cultivation, and it's a mystery. I'm not saying that to get away with it, but in the end, it's a mystery. Absolutely, like gardening. I mean, my wife has green fingers, as we say in the Holland. So she grows. There's cauliflowers and what have you. There's lettuce, for example. Well, and it's all going big, and then our neighbors trying to do the same thing. They try to copy her, actually. They imitate. They use her as a model, and it doesn't work at all. It's very, very pathetic to see, actually. So, what's it? maybe the ground, but the gardens are next to each other, so I'm not sure.
Hmm.
It's a mystery.
Stefan, there's a question here that maybe follows on from that. You've said that renewal is not about minimizing risk, but how should risk be rightly managed in the life and ministry of a young church plant? Is it always wise to ask new church leaders to take risks? Is that part of what being a new church plant is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Bottom line is, of course, church planting is a risky business. Usually people give up jobs for it, they move places, they spoil their career opportunities and stuff like that. So there are risks involved, and that's usually what entrepreneurship in general is about. People put something in their lives at stake to achieve something in this church or in this company. So to manage, I think there are some things on the handout, on the sheet that I gave. I think training is an important thing. You shouldn't send out people you don't trust, but if you send them out, you should trust them. That's the paradox. You shouldn't control them too much. But how can you trust them? Well, it's always a risk, not just on the part of the church planters, but also on the part of those who send them out. At least training helps. And then things like intervision, some supervision, in a more coaching way of doing it. I think these are, and conferences like these, so you need to interact, you need to meet, to be accountable.
I was struck by the story of you saying of this evangelist in the Netherlands saying that the fields are ready, and you're seeing this article and people responding. And I'm wondering, we're hearing, Europe is slow, Europe is, Tim Keller is not so simple to church plant here in Europe. Still, knowing this, the reality is, just talking personally in Italy, if we have heard all of this, we would never have seen, God working every semester calling
Absolutely.
Italians to Christ. So what would be a good balance of still being bold and trusting that God can work and not simplistic of the reality in Europe?
I'm thinking of, there's a difference between how you sort of authorize church planting to a general audience, so to speak. So we do church planting because the church will grow through that, we'll have many converts and so on. And there's the personal motivation. Why are you doing it? Did you wake up one morning and say, well, the statistics seem to be good, so let's do it. So I think my lecture mostly addressed the sort of official language in which church planting is often authorized and legitimized by pointing to statistics, pointing to church growth figures, and so on and so forth. And then I would say, I don't think that's the best authorization for church planting you can give. So in my book, for example, there's a whole chapter on how can you defend church planting theologically. For me, the whole issue of learning, of innovation, of being in a place where your assumptions and your life is tested to the most, so to speak, and where new questions come up, is a much more important authorization of church planting, and something that the church needs to reform all the time, than the whole idea that it will push up statistics, which is sometimes happening, but not always. So if you're a church planter, I don't hope that your motivation lies in statistics, in the idea that the church is there to grow and the church planting is a success story. Maybe you still believe in that, but then it's impossible that you have lived in Europe for a long time. I mean, maybe you've just come from the boat and you think that, but if you live here for a while, then these kind of assumptions will be destroyed. And then the question is, what have you left? This can be a good thing for you. I mean, it can help you to really trust God and to develop a spirituality of exile, so to speak, which is a crisis through which God leads his people to renewal. It's not simply a disaster, but it can feel like a disaster if you have nothing else than that. So I would say the challenge for us is to really carefully examine our own motivations. Yeah. Why do you do this? Because you hope that you're part of a success story, something else? Doing better than all the old churches?
Stefan, this is a question maybe from somebody who's only just forgiven you for Berlin.
Still traumatized?
How do we avoid saying it's a mystery as a way of excusing ineffective ministry?
Sure, yeah, that's always a problem. Well, there's a difference between a mystery and a puzzle. A puzzle requires some skills and techniques, and then you've solved it, and then you can drop it and go to the next puzzle. A mystery is something else. It's never exhausted. There's always a new angle. There's always a new depth. And in the end, you have tried everything, and then you still know, it escapes me. So that's why I used the example of gardening, cultivating a garden. It's hard work. You need a lot of skills. There's no excuse for sloppy work or to just neglect things. But then, if you have tried that all, if you've done that all, then still you know that it's a miracle if it happens. So talking about mystery and talking about spending energy and doing the best you can is not on the same level. You're working in the mystery, not at the expense of mystery. So the mystery is what surrounds you, what invites you to give the best you can, and still not being crushed if it's not successful or not so successful as you hoped for, and being very grateful and not proud if it is successful. So I would say, yeah, that's.
Could I just say that I think it's probably worth your while coming to Lisbon just for that comment. I think that that is a crucial thing that we don't think about enough. That we exist in this kind of one or other option.
Please,
it's either this is the way it is and it's right, or it's not working and we might as well fold our arms and sit down and watch telly or whatever. That it's the living in the tension of those two is where we are, and that's part of our calling and our ongoing calling.
Yeah, church planting is not a puzzle, it's a mystery. Well, yeah, true.
Yeah, that's very helpful, thank you.
Thank you. Another question that has come up, I think it's related to your second L. You said location, leadership, and legwork. So
yes.
to leadership, a little bit of the entrepreneurial spirit. It says, should we close our churches when they are 20 years old and start new ones to keep the entrepreneurial spirit?
No, because, like I said, I see no reason why these specific factors cannot be present in all the churches as well. They tend to be present more often in younger churches because, that makes sense, because usually people are sent out who are very missionally minded, because they're usually in good locations, which can become bad locations in some generations, and maybe you should start a new church then. But I would say there's not a rule that you should start over every 20 years, because there's value in all the churches as well. Most church planters I know have been raised in all the churches and have received the faith there, and are still grateful for that. So there is still, and maybe it will remain like that, most conversions in Europe still happen in good old-fashioned intergenerational evangelism, so to speak, in old churches. Most people still find the faith there. In terms of absolute numbers, I mean. So good things are happening there, and of course all the other things as well. So no, that would turn management or social science into theology. I would like to hear a bit more reasons why we should start anew every 20 years. But I think the good lesson from this is that you should, at least to remain in tune with demographic shifts and changes in society, try to plant, as a denomination, for example, at least a few churches every year.
Right. You've mentioned gardening and all that. There's a question here related to rural areas. That city to city is involved in cities, but are there best practices from a city context that you could take into church planting in a more rural context or less urban?
I find that very difficult to answer. I live in a country where the rural area is quite urban as well. So the Netherlands, there are some parts, of course, that are, but even the most remote places in the Netherlands, to close the nearest city, you can bicycle to it, basically. It's about maybe 40, 50 kilometers at most. I'm not sure whether I'm the expert here. But so we tend to have many, even in the countryside, many people who are involved somewhat remotely by an urban lifestyle. So of course it's not a city, and there are differences, but the differences are not that huge in the Netherlands, I would say. At least when my last book was on the experience of mission in the city, in a very secular environment of Amsterdam. And I got a lot of positive comment from people from villages, pastors from villages. So yeah, that's basically the same that's happening here. Mm-hmm. One of the problems for Europe could be, and that's, I think it's a good, in a sense, a very good question. The big challenge for Europe in terms of mission nowadays could be the countryside, not the cities anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking ahead a little bit, but if you look at the recent figures about churches in the cities, it seems to go relatively well compared to the countryside, at least where I live and in many other countries around us. But it's also to do with demographic shifts and so on, so it's not so easy to give a straightforward answer to that. Probably you need new forms of church that's in living rooms, monastic types of church probably. So those kind of churches, but the whole idea of a congregation, which with its own building and at least 200 people to maintain it and to pay for a pastor. In the city, to an extent, that can still be done here and there, but not in the countryside anymore in most places.
Another question that has come up, this is interesting. You mentioned innovation is a dark road. Can you unpack a little bit about this comment?
But there's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, the dark road is maybe a bit of a dramatic way to put it, but my point is there is a difference between, let's say, adjustments and innovation. So an adjustment is like, we have a morning worship service and we don't see too many teenagers there. Can we adapt certain things to draw in more teenagers? That's an adaptation question, because you can see the answer from where you are. You don't have to do too much. It's not very risky, although it can be risky in some churches. Anyway, innovation is more like, are Sunday morning worship service the best way to do church at all? That's a very different question. It's a question that puts everything at stake to some extent, and maybe is also a bit too much to ask in a balanced, relatively well-going church, which is a little bit older, and that maybe you need some place of experimentation there. Maybe without calling them church plants right away, maybe just to call them a laboratory, or a place of experiment, or a place where we plant gospel seeds and see what's happening here. Stuff like that, and we'll see whether it will be something that we can recognize, that the church can recognize as a church. We'll see. Sometimes I think we use the word church planting too soon, which also, there's a good reason for that, of course, because you don't want to have young churches in paternalistic relationships and all the churches looking at them, we'll see when we can call you a church. But there's also another side of it, that you take away a lot of relaxation and experimentation if it needs to be churched right away. So if it can be a place where some creative and gifted people work together and do some things by planting the gospel in a new context and prayerfully look what comes from it, it may be a good idea to not call it church right away and just to see, well, we'll see what comes.
You've begun to answer the next question in that answer there, that which is about church plants and networks such as City to City, pioneering on behalf of the whole church and, in a sense, experimenting and communicating what happens in those contexts. Maybe some of that comes up in your book, does it?
I didn't get the question very well.
The idea of pioneering new ways of doing church and networks, like giving people the freedom to do something that's
it's in the book.
Different.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole chapter on innovation there, and these are the kind of things that are discussed as well. What I discussed there are three different ways to. There are sort of anarchistic places, also in church plants. I mean, there's some
anarchistic.
Well, yeah, sort of very unregulated, sort of mild anarchy. People very consciously taking the distance from what they consider as the older church, and now there's always a tricky thing there, because it can turn sectarian in the way that we have reinvented the church and everyone should follow us, which is basically the sectarian option. It could also be more of a monastic idea, that we create a structure where we can explore some insights of Christianity to the full, to make it, to radicalize it, so to speak, which is a monastic thing, but we do it for the whole church, which has more of my sympathy, I must be honest. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to have more hybrid types of groups where people who are very different meet each other. And there's a sort of organized innovation that you, for example, find in the Fresh Expressions movement in England or in the pioneering projects in the Protestant Church in the Netherlands, which is a bit of a paradox, but can you organize innovation? But anyway, which are a bit more bureaucratic. That helps them to be more stable. It is a risk that it becomes less innovative, but anyway. So there are 3 different ways, and I discussed them quite elaborately in the book, yeah.
I like that idea of innovation on behalf of the church, particularly when very often those kinds of experiments are being criticized or frowned upon by the wider church because they're not understood. So to maintain that mindset of we're not just doing this in order to create our own little empire, but that we are seeking to do something that is for the benefit of the church on a bigger scale. That's really, I find that very helpful.
One of the basic questions in my book is, why do we plant churches in a continent where there are many churches already? It's a very simple question, a question that's often waved away very quickly by church planters. But it's an important question, and it helped me to get my mind going. Yes, why do we do that? And then this is one of the answers. There are more, but this is one of them.
Yeah. That's it.
This has been very helpful. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for your talk and for your Q&A as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some announcements for this afternoon and for lunch. So, if you can get your handbook, please, and turn into page 8.